Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. I'm Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa. The Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And we're here to pretend nothing crazy is going on in the world right now. You know, we're just going to be good Stoics here at the Stoa. And we're going to talk about collective intelligence. And Anita Woolley is joining us. And in a moment, Rob Hart will be introducing her, and Rob will be the MC for the day. Most Stoa regulars know who Rob is. And Rob is an admirer and of Anita's work. So he's the perfect person to MC this event. So yeah, without further ado, 60 minutes today, I will take in Rob.
Hey everybody, thanks for being here. And Anita, thank you so much for coming. So Anita is a teacher at at the highest degree of teacherhood. She studied at Harvard University and got her doctorate there in education, and now not only teaches at Carnegie Mellon University, but is also a lead researcher in collective intelligence. I'll let her sum up what that research entails. What does collective intelligence really mean in a research perspective? And I think you'll find her work very interesting and illuminating to the things that interest us here. So yeah, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Anita.
Great, thanks. Happy to be here, and thanks everybody for coming. I know at least where I am, it's starting to feel a little bit like the world is under siege. So at least it's pleasant for me to be here and talking about some other things. Let's see, I'm just gonna share my screen because I have a few slides to share with you as I talk about a little bit about what we've done just to get us started, and then we can have some discussion from there. So I'm currently a professor at Carnegie Mellon, and as Rob mentioned, all my career has been spent studying teams and what enables them to collaborate effectively, and most recently within the last 10 years, looking a lot at collective intelligence. And so I'm just going to give you a very brief overview of a little bit of what we've done on our research here, and then you know, I'll welcome your questions, and maybe in the course of that I'll end up telling you about some other things because I just kind of made some guesses about what might be interesting to start with. So I just wanted to give you a sense of where we started with a lot of this, which was you know, as I was studying teams and wondering, you know, what makes teams work together well. You know, earlier in my career, there was a lot of thought that, okay, you know, if you want to have a smart team, you need to put together smart people. But I knew lots of examples where that wasn't really the case, right? I mean, if you're in academia, if you're looking around government, if you're in many organizations, you know, some very individually smart people get together and do some pretty dumb things. And so it was just, you know, something that myself and some of my collaborators were really curious about. And so we wanted to take a look at, you know, if it was the case that there are some teams that are systematically smarter than others, and if it was an intelligence that came from something other than just the intelligence of the people on the team, if it really was something that came from their collaboration, from their interaction. And so we started off thinking about this very much in the framework of individual intelligence. So if you think about individual intelligence, you don't really conclude that an individual is intelligent based on seeing them do one thing really well, right? So if somebody's really good at math, you'd say, oh, they're really good at math, right? But for people to conclude that somebody is intelligent, you need to see that they're good at many different things, right? And so conceptually, the idea is that intelligence is this underlying ability to perform well across many different domains. And so most of the intelligence tests, we could debate about intelligence testing if you want. I don't really want to though tonight, but you know, they measure intelligence by sampling from a lot of different domains. And from there, you know, draw this inference about G, or this underlying general intelligence, that drives performance across domains and over time, right? So, and so we do have a lot of empirical data showing that people who have high general intelligence perform well across many domains and over long periods of time. So we were curious if the same might be true for teams. Are there particular teams that perform really well across domains and over time, and really kind of also make better use of other things that should help their performance? So better use of individual ability, better use of the resources they have available, et cetera. So that was the question that we started off with. So to test that question, we had groups come into our lab, and we had them spend a better part of a day together, because what we wanted to do was have them work on a lot of different kinds of problems. Up to this point, the hypothesis would have been, based on existing data, that teams that were good at one kind of thing would not be good at another kind of thing. Like, to be a really creative team, we thought you have to interact in certain ways. To be a really, detail-oriented, precise team, you have to operate in another way. And so we gave them tasks that would be very different, where we would expect they would have to work together in very different ways. So creativity tasks, mathematical tasks, verbal tasks, artistic tasks, etc. And so they spent a long time working together. And we looked at whether or not teams that performed well in one kind of task performed well in other kinds of tasks. And we found that they did. And we used their score across these tasks as sort of a collective intelligence score, kind of the equivalent of an IQ score, but in this case for the teams. And we used it to predict how they would perform in the future when we brought them back to do this video game simulation. And we found that it was pretty highly predictive of how that same team performed in the future, and much more predictive than the IQ of the individual members of the team. So we replicated this a few times in our initial studies and more times since, and pretty consistently found that regardless of what other task we had them come and do later, that the collective intelligence of the team was much more predictive of their performance than knowing the average intelligence of members, or even the maximum intelligence, because I get asked that a lot too. Like, if they have a really smart leader, would that person be able to get them to perform well? And it turns out, no, there's some other things that are important. So we also went on to try to understand, well, okay, if it's not really about individual intelligence, well, then what is it? And so we explored a whole variety of things that are often associated with group performance in the literature, things like group satisfaction, cohesion, motivation. So how do the members feel about each other, right? And so another surprising thing was that it doesn't matter how the group members feel about each other. They could like each other, they could maybe not like each other. It didn't have any relationship with collective intelligence. So some of the standard things we think will help team performance don't necessarily. Just kind of getting everybody together and doing team building by itself, it could help, but not in terms of collective intelligence. So some of the things, though, that we found, other things that we found that were correlated and have, again, found multiple times in the years since, have also been interesting and somewhat surprising. So initially, we observed a positive correlation between the proportion of women in the group and collective intelligence. And that is something that has come up over and over again in various data sets. The strength of the relationship varies, et cetera, but almost always it's there. And it turns out, though, that yes, having women in the team is helpful, but a big part of the explanation for it relates to another characteristic, which is social perceptiveness. So we give a test like this called the Reading the Mind and the Eyes test to the people in our studies. And it tests people for their ability to pick up on subtle nonverbal cues and draw inferences about what others are thinking or feeling. And so this is just one ability within a broader suite of abilities of social intelligence, which relates to not only being able to perceive what others are thinking or feeling, but also to anticipate how they're going to respond, and to manage a social interaction in a way that will keep things productive, and to respect the fact that it might have an impact on how that person's going to think or feel. So we gave people this test, we regularly do in our studies. We find that groups that have a higher average score on this test tend to be more collectively intelligent. Women on average score higher on tests like this than men. And so that actually explains a lot of the reason, not always all of it, but a lot of the reason why having more women in the group raises collective intelligence. You basically raise the average in terms of these kinds of skills. And I'll talk in a few more slides about how this plays out in the group. The other thing about who is in the group that is important is diversity. So we have found a variety of different forms of diversity are important. In some of our studies, and I'll mention one in a little bit, ethnic diversity is important. Here we were looking at cognitive style diversity. So it turns out that people characteristically have different cognitive styles. And the cognitive styles that we look at tend to differentiate people who go into different professions. So there's a cognitive style that is predominant in engineering. There's a different one that is predominant in sort of the arts and design. And then yet another one that's predominant in more verbally intensive professions like law, journalism, et cetera. And so we find that teams need to be at least moderately cognitively diverse with respect to these styles in order to reach the highest levels of collective intelligence. If they're not diverse enough, they tend not to have some of the key perspectives that they need to really reach the highest levels. If they're too diverse, unless they're very skilled in collaboration, it can be hard for them to figure out how to work together. So what left to their own devices without any facilitation, groups that are at least moderately cognitively diverse tend to be the most collectively intelligent. We also look a lot at communication in our studies. So whether people are working together face-to-face, sometimes we use these gizmos called sociometric badges that pick up on who's talking when, who's interrupting, whether or not somebody's nodding when someone else is talking, et cetera. And what we find is that groups that have more communication and more equal communication tend to be more collectively intelligent. Or said the other way, if somebody is dominating the conversation, the group tends to be much less collectively intelligent. And so this is where the social perceptiveness comes into play, because when you have more people, more women in the group and more socially perceptive people in the group, the group tends to talk more and to talk more equally. So that's one of the ways that having these people in the group enhances collective intelligence. And we find that this is true even for groups working together online. So we've conducted our studies in a whole variety of different settings. Sometimes groups are face-to-face, sometimes they're online but doing video conference, sometimes they're online just doing chat. And the patterns are the same across all of those different modes. Collective intelligence, is kind of can be just as high in groups online. Some people are surprised to hear that, but that's something we have found and other studies have as well. And the patterns with communication still exist. So groups that communicate a lot and communicate more equally tend to be more collectively intelligent. One thing that really interested us from the very beginning was the fact that we could measure the collective intelligence of a group of strangers that were just meeting for the first time, and that it would be predictive of how they performed later, even when they knew each other pretty well. And we were curious about that because we wondered if, what is it that's happening right when people are getting together that could enable them to develop collective intelligence in a way that wouldn't really change a lot. And so one of the areas we decided to explore was to look at physiological signals, and especially synchrony. One thing in the broader literature on physiological synchrony is that we know that it develops very quickly, and that it does play a really important role in modulating interaction. So when you are really trying to listen to somebody, when you are really communicating effectively, over time, what you see is that with the communicators, a whole variety of different signals synchronize. Your heartbeat can synchronize, your tone of voice, your pitch synchronizes, your various body movements, sway, facial expressions synchronize. So we were curious if this might be part of how some groups very quickly develop collective intelligence. And we also were curious about whether or not this would happen online or be relevant to groups working online. And so we've conducted a few studies on this. I'm just going to mention a few of the findings. And we were especially focused on things like heart rate, as well as synchrony and facial expressions, because those are really indicators. Well, the synchrony is often an indicator of shared feelings. And again, we still have this puzzle about the lack of connection between satisfaction and collective intelligence. So do shared feelings play a role here? And then also with the facial expressions, when you see two people whose facial expressions are in synchrony, it really indicates a deep level of mutual attention. This was first observed with mothers holding their infants, and so when there was a deep level of connection and mutual attention between the mother and the infant, they would be mimicking each other's facial expressions. So we were curious if we would see this in the interacting groups. So for this study, we brought them into our lab, but we put people in different rooms and we had them communicate much how we are now, using video conference and seeing each other. Well, in the first study, seeing each other on screen, and we had them all wired up so that we were picking up on things like their heart rate, their galvanic skin response, which is kind of how sweaty you are, which indicates how nervous or highly aroused you are. And then we measured their collective intelligence as they were working together. So what we found was, first of all, as we predicted, that synchrony in facial expressions was predictive of collective intelligence. So groups that develop a high level of collective intelligence are deeply paying attention to each other. Collective intelligence, once again, was not related to group satisfaction. So people would have worked together, been highly collectively intelligent, but may or may not have thought it was fun to do so. Synchrony in electrodermal activity, so how sweaty we are, how much our palms are sweating, was predictive of group satisfaction. So if we have a similar level of arousal, we enjoy the interaction much more. However, these physiological indicators were also not associated. So there are kind of these two different pathways, right? Where, one is sort of like, a cognitive connection where I'm really attending to you, and that is really fundamental to collective intelligence. And then there's this other pathway where I'm feeling you, right? We are in sync in terms of our emotional experience, and that is not necessarily associated with collective intelligence. The social perceptiveness, once again, was associated with collective intelligence in this study, as it pretty much is in all of our studies. And here, this was another way that social perceptiveness was enhancing collective intelligence. People who are more socially perceptive were facilitating this synchrony and facial expression. So they were being much more attentive to, sort of the expressions of their collaboration partner. Now, in a subsequent, actually, there's one other finding I wanted to share with you on this, which relates to ethnic diversity. So we found in this study, as we found in a few others, that actually the ethnic diversity of the collaborators was related to collective intelligence. It was not related to group satisfaction. That's also, unfortunately, a consistent finding in the literature. However, one thing that moderated that was, again, this electrodermal activity, this sweatiness, this arousal. One of the ways that ethnic diversity was disrupting satisfaction was by actually disrupting synchrony in this. So if I'm more nervous in this interaction than you are, then we experienced less satisfaction. However, if we did synchronize in that way, then we experienced more satisfaction. And so in some ways this could, there's a whole bunch of literature about how to foster better relationships across people who come from different ethnic backgrounds. And a lot of it has to do with contact and spending more time together. And one of the ways that might help actually is to make people more comfortable. And so this could be, a mechanism explaining why that works, right? That we would then have, you wouldn't have somebody who's really nervous in this interaction, or we would be similarly nervous. And so that might lead us to actually enjoy each other's company as well as to work together better. So another question, so I get a lot of questions these days, especially with the pandemic and everybody working in teams online about, does this affect collective intelligence and collaboration? Do we all need to be on Zoom in order to be collectively intelligent? And similar kinds of questions. And so one of the interesting findings that we have kind of in press right now, it relates to video conferencing. So we did another version of the study I just told you about, but we varied whether or not people had video, they had their cameras on or not. So they were interacting, they could hear each other, but in some groups they could see each other and in other groups they couldn't. And we found some surprising things. So the first is that it made no difference for collective intelligence if you had cameras or not. You could be just as collectively intelligent. And in fact, we found that in some ways, the cameras disrupted collective intelligence for some teams. And that was through this pathway, which I'll explain. So if they had visual cues, which means they had the camera on, we found that it was slightly more likely that you would have certain people dominate the conversation than if they didn't have cameras. And when you had people dominate the conversation, it disrupted this other thing that we have looked at. Here it's labeled audio synchrony. There are a variety of terms for it. Sometimes it can also be called prosodic synchrony, but essentially we're looking at the degree to which the group members start to synchronize their tone of voice, their pitch, the rate at which they speak. There are a variety of qualities of voice that you can measure. And groups that are highly collectively intelligent tend to synchronize these as they interact. However, we found in some of the teams, and it was more likely if they had the cameras on, that this was disrupted. So as it turns out, video cameras can actually be a problem, and they can especially be a problem if they're disrupting the audio quality. So my key takeaway here is if you're ever in a video conference and the video is disrupting the audio quality, shut off the camera. So anyway, Zoom may not be happy to hear that video cameras are not as important as they thought, but there you go. All right, so just in conclusion here, what we're finding in summary, and I just mentioned a few of our studies, we've got a lot of other things going on that, I'll probably talk about as we answer questions. But what we find consistently is that there is this characteristic collective intelligence in teams that is not really just a function of the intelligence of individual members, but really is more driven by who's in the team with respect to what they bring for enriching the collaboration. So their social skills, diversity of perspective, et cetera, and the nature of how the group collaborates. And so one thing that, again, is surprising to a lot of people is that it's not really just how people feel about each other that seems to drive this. I mean, there are other elements that seem to be even more important when we talk about collective intelligence. And so when we look at the physiological cues that are involved, the facial expression synchrony and the vocal synchrony, which are both really indicators of how carefully people are attending to one another, are the biggest drivers of collective intelligence. And so, and ironically, video conference might actually undermine those inadvertently. So it's something just to be aware of. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen so you can all see each other and I can see you. And I'm happy to entertain some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anita. That was wonderful. And a bit like drinking from a fire hose, I think I got a lot of lessons there. So I want to start just with some questions from the crowd, because I feel like there were some really good ones that came up. I saw a lot of +1s with Evan. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Really interesting presentation, a lot of content to digest, like Rob was saying. So my question is, so I think you're probably aware of the research on how things like singing together or drumming together can lead pretty rapidly to the sort of biological synchrony that you're talking about here. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we might mine the synchronization techniques of various religions and cultures and how this sort of ritual component might contribute to better collective intelligence.
No, I mean, that's definitely one of the experiments that we would love to run that we haven't run yet, right? Is kind of how can we enhance synchrony? But I think it's not only, it's not any synchrony, it would have to be synchrony that really is about this mutual attention. So, tone of voice, facial expression. And so that's where I would start first. So there are a variety of other synchronies that I think do operate more on the socio-emotional level. And so some of the ones that you were mentioning are definitely among those. But I think the first place we would start would be more, in the mutual attention versions of those. But yeah, I don't have the experiment yet. Wish we did. And what's interesting too, again, with video conference and Zoom, if anyone has ever tried to sing with others on Zoom and how it's a train wreck, right? It actually disrupts synchrony. And that's one of there have been some other newer studies coming out about how, the reason why you feel so exhausted after a bunch of meetings on Zoom is because of that slight, delay in synchrony between, what somebody's saying and so on, and what they're maybe expressing with their face. And your brain is trying to put those together. And so, so I think the video conferencing piece of it, that would be an interesting angle to put on it, because it's really hard to achieve it there.
As a quick follow-up to that, so as a quick follow-up, I'm curious, so as far as this goes, there are plenty of other interesting, say, non-musical ritual techniques out there that seem to have evolved culturally for the purpose of reinforcing the exact type of synchrony that's relevant for collective intelligence. So I'm wondering if speculatively you have any thoughts about what might be promising as far as what sort of, things in the broad category of ritual might be useful for enhancing collective intelligence, specifically in the pandemic era over Zoom or other technological platforms.
Maybe say a little bit more about which ones you're thinking of.
Well, I'm thinking of just the broad category of ritual. So for example, things like in many different religious traditions, all engaging in a series of symbolically coded motions together, right? Or getting up and doing the same set of physical exercises together, especially with video on. These are just this is kind of off the cuff speculation. And if you don't feel comfortable speculating, I understand, but I'm just curious what your gut says might be the best sort of places to look for that, because it's an area of deep interest for myself.
Yeah, again, I don't know if I wouldn't start necessarily by getting people to focus on physically synchronizing as much as maybe having a shared experience that would bring about that synchrony naturally, right? So for example, we might end up having facial expression synchrony because we're both deeply engaged in a conversation that is eliciting similar reactions. And so I, will notice that you're reacting. So that is, affecting me, but it's also, you and my expression is affecting you, and we're both being affected by the content. So I would actually start there more, again, kind of in the cognitive area versus like if you're simply marching in unison or a variety of other different things that people might do in various settings. I don't know that it would necessarily engage the cognitive connection that I think is going to be really important. But that's just kind of, again, all speculation.
Helpful though, thanks.
Great. Next is Adam Golding. I'm going to unmute and ask your question.
Hi there. Let me just scroll up and get my question here. We were talking about diversity of cognitive styles, and you were saying that there could be too much. And I was wondering if that was a matter of there being sort of a missing hole in the middle of the distribution of cognitive styles, where like people there isn't a mediator in between the two groups that have a different cognitive style, or if it's the sheer width, or if that's been looked at. The other part I said here is perhaps discourse needs to be structured so that people close in conversational space are similar enough to one another, or in cognitive style, or maybe in political orientation as well. Like if you want to solve a problem with some kind of collective intelligence, if any two people who are talking to each other, they individually their cognitive styles are too different, it would be a problem. But maybe the collective is fine if you have that chain of people who are similar enough to each other when they're talking to each other.
Yeah, actually, what you're describing, I have a former graduate student, Ashani Agarwal, who's a faculty member down in Brazil now, but she is interested in exactly what you're talking about. And what she has found is that you can have very diverse groups, but if you have somebody within that group who can serve as a bridge, they can then be much more collectively intelligent than less diverse groups. And so in the case of the cognitive styles that I was talking about, the majority of the population expresses strength predominantly in one cognitive style, but you have a small group of about 15% of the population that can express strength in more than one cognitive style. And so if you have those people in a group, you have, people who are very, who are opposite in their cognitive styles, but then somebody who bridges, then the group is much more collectively intelligent. And what's interesting is that same sort of finding has been reflected even not in our research, but in other people's research on cultural diversity. You can have people who are from different cultures, but then if you have somebody in there who is bicultural, and even if it's somebody who's bicultural, but not in the same cultures as the other people, just by the experience of having extensive experience in two cultures, they can help facilitate a conversation in which, the group has to do something that really, draws on the different perspectives from the different cultural groups. And so what they find is that it's kind of what you were intuiting, that the person who's the bridge can actually, talk to these different groups and sort of translate almost, right? In terms of why, what one person is preferring over another, and anticipate maybe why this person will be confused by what this person is saying. So yes, so that's definitely, and so when you don't have that, just numerically, that's when diversity is the highest, because you have everybody is different and nobody overlaps. So if we're just calculating diversity, the groups that are way out on the tails are those that have this very little overlap. And so without any other facilitation, or without somebody in there who's really good at facilitating, then they struggle.
How about Chris D? Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, hey Anita, thanks for coming on. So my question has to do with the relationship between leadership and its ability to cultivate collective intelligence, and how leadership shapes synchrony. Is high collective intelligence more capable of a distributed leadership organization?
Okay, there are a couple of different parts to your question, so I'll try to remember them all, and if I don't, you can bring me back. So we have one study where we have looked at leadership. This was an experiment, and the group could select their own leader, and we found, and then in one condition, they selected a leader, and that was just their leader for the whole time that they were working together. In another condition, they selected a leader, and we told them that they could select another leader later. And the reason we did that is to create like status instability. So you have a leader, but that person, other people now are thinking, oh, maybe I could be the leader, right? So then you have some hierarchy instability. And then we had a comparison group that was just equal status. Like there was no leadership election, there was no mention of leadership. What we found was that actually, so again, these are leaders that the group themselves selected after some interaction. So the groups that had a leader who was stable were more collectively intelligent. The groups that had the leader, but there was competition, there was instability, were actually significantly less collectively intelligent. And what we found, kind of relating to synchrony, is that synchrony was higher in the groups that had the stable leader, and synchrony was lower, significantly lower, in the groups where there was competition. And so it was, that was an important piece of this relationship. And And then one of the other manifestations that we saw is that in the groups with the unstable leader, with the competition, there was also a lot of interrupting. That was one of the ways that synchrony was disrupted, is that as they were talking, people were kind of talking over each other and interrupting a lot more. So in that study, leaders were beneficial, especially if they were in a stable leadership position, because they kind of created, these other conditions for these other positive behaviors to manifest. I would say, though, there are other settings in which, as I pointed out in the lab study I was talking about, the groups selected their leader. There are certainly other settings where in organizations, as well as in lab studies, where the leader is selected for them or appointed or randomly appointed. And there the findings are much more mixed. And it really depends a lot on the characteristics of that leader. And one of the issues that can come up is that if the leader manifests their role by doing all of the talking, that can disrupt collective intelligence. And that is something that we do see more commonly in organizational settings, is that some leaders enact their role by doing all of the talking, and then that's not good for the collective intelligence. You were asking about distributed leadership in teams?
Yeah, so higher collective intelligence for flatter hierarchies, essentially.
I'm trying to think if I have data that speaks to that. I'm not sure if I do. I think I would come back to the thing I was just saying a moment ago, which is it really depends on who the leader is and what they're doing. Because certainly, and this is true in other studies as well, not just the collective intelligence studies, if you have a leader who's good, it's great. And if you have a leader who's bad, it's terrible. And that's why, some organizations have gone more toward distributed leadership models, because it kind of reduces the risks of having that one, appointed leader be terrible. But that isn't something that we have looked at directly in our research. So that's an interesting question.
Nick Shore, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. Yeah. Just run into space. So in the work of people like Otto Scharmer and Thera Yu, who have done work on collective presencing, we space kind of work. Are you familiar with that kind of work, the we space work?
A little bit, but ask your question and then I might have you say more if I need a little more background.
Yeah, there's talk about what they call like the circle being, or the sort of the third thing that enters the space that's beyond just the energy of the individuals. Seems to be something else coming into the space, which is difficult to explain, and it kind of descends from somewhere, whatever that is, which is slightly on the edge of mystical, one could say. Have you got any points of view about that? Have you got any evidence around that? Do people talk about that? Does that sound like woo to you?
Certainly people bring it up when we talk about collective intelligence, kind of where is it coming from? As a scientist, I think primarily a lot of what we're looking at, and what I think is true, is that, there definitely is, when we talk about chemistry, right? There are things that are in the combinations of people, and kind of what happens when those combinations are put together, and whether or not there's like another force that's part of that as well. I think, a lot of people are interested in that from a variety of perspectives. It's not anything that we've integrated into our research necessarily. People who are, think about these in statistical terms might think about them in terms of unexplained variance, right? Like you have, things that you measure that have an effect, and then you have always like usually more variance that you can't explain. And so they can point to some of these other things, but it's not anything that we've actually done formally in our research.
Great. Robert Best, could you unmute and ask your question?
I can't hear you if you're talking.
Okay, I guess he can't unmute. I'm going to read his question for him. So he asks, I have to scroll up to get it again, sorry. He asked if there are elements of increased collective intelligence that have more to do with the structure of the group than the people and their capacities. Is there things about the processes or practices that they employ? Have you, other than doing different leadership practices, have you talked about different structures that help or hurt group interaction?
Certainly, and I think what I kind of hear from part of that question is kind of what's the relative contribution, right, of the attributes of the members versus the things that they might be doing. And we actually have a paper right now under review where we were able to accumulate a fairly large data set of over 1,000 teams and had measures of these various things to try to get at that question. And what we found in one of our analyses is that the processes that the teams were engaging in were about twice as important as the composition of the teams in sort of determining collective intelligence. And so the kinds of processes we looked at fell into 3 different categories. So one was really just about how much effort. So, how good was the group at getting everyone, to kind of put in their best effort and also effort kind of in the same direction so that they're kind of working, in ways that reinforce each other. The second had to do with their strategy. So how are they combining their efforts? Were they being smart, in terms of what they work together on, what they spread out on? Were they getting everybody engaged and making use of everybody as well as they could? And then the final thing was, were they really good at picking up on who knows what so that they were making really good use of the different talents of the people in the group? So you can imagine if you're thinking about, Rob, I don't know when you say structure, if you're talking about like organizational structure, but you can imagine there would be a variety of structures in an organizational sense that would foster these things, right? So, whether it's identifying roles, whether it's, we talked about leadership earlier, if you had a good leader who was able to kind of put some of these things in place, those things should enhance collective intelligence. And based on, this one analysis, it sounds like, it would do quite a bit above and beyond just the capabilities of the members themselves.
Great, thank you. David Swedlow, could you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to modify it a little bit from what I wrote originally because Nick's question touched on that a bit, and that asking about collective presencing and warm data labs, circling. There are a number of practices that have arisen recently that are kind of a collective relational dialogue practice. And I was curious if you had looked at that. It sounds like not so much, but I'm interested as well in that the profusion of those kinds of things. So I'm curious, like over time, there seemed to be a difference in the way that collective intelligence expresses, or are you noticing things about the way that groups express collective intelligence or a desire actually to engage in kind of collective intelligence practices?
Express collective intelligence. So the way that we think about collective intelligence, it's really, when we talk about its expression, it's really manifest in sort of effectiveness, good performance, right, across a variety of different areas and over time. Okay, so when you say, are there differences in the expression of collective intelligence, maybe you can say a little bit more about what you mean by that. Like, are we seeing it in more places or in fewer places or in different kinds of groups or?
Actually, I'll go back to Nick's earlier question as well. He mentioned something about I was thinking about the Manhattan Project or something else. Like there's places where a bunch of men to get together and they're solving problems, or NASA as well, Apollo 13, where there is not a lot of diversity in one way, and yet they seem to be very focused on certain kinds of solutions solving. But there's something different there, it feels like, than sort of a contextually based intelligence, which is more relational or social kind of intelligence. And so I'm curious about, like, that's a way it might almost be intelligence versus wisdom. And again, these are I'm informed a little bit by cognitive science and John Vervaeke. So there's a lot of that background that I'm sort of bringing this curiosity through, and I'm curious.
Yeah. Well, so I think certainly, there are lots of examples, and I can't really speak in depth to whether or not, the group involved in the Manhattan Project or, groups at various prominent examples from NASA, if they are collectively intelligent in the sense that we're talking about or not. We know that they performed very well, in a particular problem context, but whether or not it would, broaden beyond that or sustain over time, I don't know. So I mean, that's kind of one thought I have. I think what we're getting to understand, though, more and more about groups that have this kind of broad and sustained collective intelligence is that there are a variety of systems that they develop that help perpetuate that, right? And so there are things that help them just do things effectively, perform tasks, solve problems, whatever they're doing. But then there are also a variety of other functions that are really the maintenance functions, right? That sort of help the group stay aligned in terms of what's important, what's not important, and understanding what each other's priorities are so that they can be nimble, as they go across situations and over time. And so I don't know if that taps into some of what you were getting at with the wisdom piece of it, because I don't think it can just be about the task or a task for it to really be collective intelligence in the sense that we're talking about.
So I have a question myself. It's around your own practice of teaching. How has your practice of teaching been changed by your learning about collective intelligence? Do you set up the classroom differently or prime students differently or anything?
Well, yes, I think so. So a big thing that has become clear, and I think I saw a question about this flash by in the chat, but again, if I didn't catch it, sorry, correctly, about collective intelligence sustaining over time. We do find that it tends to be pretty stable. It forms quickly and ends up being really stable. And what that means is that there's a lot about what goes on when a team is formed that is really influential. In terms of thinking carefully about who's in the team, thinking carefully about what sorts of norms of interaction get set up, what kinds of structures, because structures are actually hard to change. So who's gonna step into the leadership role if there isn't an appointed leader, that kind of thing. And so when I'm teaching about this, then, we put a lot of emphasis on that. How can you really try to set things up? You can also talk about how to fix things when they're broken, but that's a lot harder to do and a lot less certain than really trying to get them right from the beginning. So that is one big part, I think, a shift, and probably something that's different from what people might get in a different course on team dynamics, because mine ends up really being about, how do you design a collective for intelligence?
Okay, Narayan or Narayan, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name correctly. Would you like to unmute?
It's Narayan. Yeah, Anita, thanks so much for coming on to the Stoa. This has just been fantastic. I'm curious to draw things a little bit more into the future. I'm curious about where is your research going over the next decade, and potentially how do you see this work transforming the world?
Well, I don't know. I'm just a modest professor, so I don't know about transforming the world, but certainly there's more and more of research topics and interests that are growing in the area of artificial intelligence for everybody. And certainly we've thought a lot about that with respect to collective intelligence. So, if you have, well, first of all, quickly, even now, one could say that, we're a group that is collaborating not just by human intelligence, but by artificial intelligence. So even though, I'm sorry, Zoom, that I criticized your video, but you're, enabling us to actually, communicate. So, but as we go forward, that will be more and more the case. And the technologies that are involved may be taking a more and more active role in structuring the nature of that interaction and how information, flows across people and et cetera. So there are a lot of questions about, okay, what are the ways that these technologies could actually enhance collective intelligence? It's harder than you might think. We've done some very low level experiments trying it, and humans don't like to be managed by bots, and so it's a lot easier to screw up a group with that than it is to help a group. But I think a really interesting frontier in that is artificial social intelligence. So how can we develop technologies that will do some of what I was talking about earlier with social perceptiveness? So figuring out, oh, the video in this interaction is really messing things up, I should shut off. Or, oh, Anita, you're talking a lot and you should let other people talk more. So maybe I'll just kind of mute your mic or whatever, or prompt somebody else who hasn't spoken as much. I mean, those are kind of silly, simpler things. There could be a whole lot of other more subtle things around technology, deciding, when to intervene, how to intervene, picking up on your emotional state, maybe trying to manage your emotional state. And so interesting and scary at the same time to start to think about these things, but it's definitely, one of those areas. And I think folks like me who are really motivated and interested in how can I create more like really powerful collaborative experiences, for myself, for everybody, are interested in being part of the conversation around technology, because the technology is going to develop. It would just be nice if it would develop in a way that actually helps and enhances human relationship. So, and I think it can. I'm an optimist. So, so that's definitely one of the areas we're working in now.
Great. Matthew C., would you want to unmute and ask?
Hey, I am just wondering if there are any correlations between like participants' background, whether it's like university education or not, whether the people are studying like philosophy or the humanities as opposed to like science, economics, business. There's a lot of evidence showing that humanities studies encourages empathy and relating with others, whereas the other ones are more specialized. So I'm curious if you noticed anything about that.
No, I mean, in the data sets that we've had where we have that information about people, we haven't noticed a systematic correlation with their, their professional background necessarily, or even one. We did have some questions around, just language or how verbal somebody was, and we didn't really see a consistent correlation there either. But you're thinking more specifically, like if I study literature, I know there were actually some research studies looking at if people read classic literature, did that enhance their social perceptiveness, although there were different competing findings on that. But we haven't seen that in our data sets, but it hasn't been a big focus either. So we don't have lots of data on that.
Cool, thanks.
So I'm curious myself about group size and how that influences their ability to demonstrate collective intelligence.
Yeah, that is an issue that we've looked at some. And initially we expected there to be kind of, some sort of a curvilinear effect, right? Because in sort of classic research on teams, up to a certain degree, you kind of have more people. That means you have more inputs and you can be smarter. But then at some point you start to get, what they call process loss, where you can't coordinate as effectively and things kind of trail off. But what we've been finding, and especially since this is where technology comes into play, right? We tend to administer our studies using a platform where we measure collective intelligence. And it's one that kind of works a little like Google Docs, if you will, where like you can see what everybody's doing and everybody can work at the same time. And I can, edit what you just wrote and all that kind of stuff. And so what we find is actually you can get groups that are pretty big and there's a positive correlation with collective intelligence and group size. When we start to get into the 30, 40, 50 person range, that's when we start to see some plateauing, and maybe not everybody is contributing at that point. So you have some questions there, but it's much higher than would be true in sort of the classic paradigms of team collaboration. And again, this is another area where there's a technology story involved. Everybody can work simultaneously, whereas if you're sitting around a meeting looking at a whiteboard, that isn't the case.
Thanks. There was one last question here. I think it's all we're going to have time for, but Robert Best had another great one asking about how your metric or sort of measuring process for collective intelligence has changed over time, or has it?
Yeah, certainly, in our earlier studies, we did have people physically co-located in a room, and we were able to measure, some things about like vocal communication, but other than that, didn't have a lot of detail about who was doing what, saying what, didn't have video about facial expression or anything like that. Now, because we are using this online platform, we have a lot more granular detail about not only talking, but who's doing what, who's contributing what. We can capture measures about what the individuals are good at as they're working, and then how the group is drawing on that in their shared work projects. So it gives us a much finer grained way of getting at the processes underlying collective intelligence. So that's been exciting, because it's led us to kind of articulate a little bit more clearly what it is that's really contributing.
All right, well, thank you. We are now at the top of the hour, so I just want to thank you again for coming and presenting and answering some great questions. Really appreciate all the depth that you went to there. And Peter, do you have any announcements or anything?
Sure, I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but Anita, thank you so much for coming to Stoa.
Thanks for having me, this was fun.
Rob, thanks for emceeing that. It was an excellent session. Yeah, on Friday, the next event is Shadow Play Under the Covers in 2021 with Aaron and Alyssa. So our two Jungian shadow experts are going to come in and then do some exercises, so you can check that out. And on Saturday, we have an event. David, could you plug that event?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I'm really excited to be bringing Frank Hiley to the Stoa for a two-part series called Spirituality and Consciousness Explained. So the first part this Saturday will be about consciousness, and he's going to describe his two-agent model. And I think by the end of the session, he'll prove to all of us that we are already living in a simulation, that we are, in fact, models living in our own world model generated by our brain. It's going to be super fascinating. So I hope to see you all there.
Cool. And the last event I'll plug, and you might like this, Anita. So at the Stoa, we have a wisdom gym, and then there's something like all these, they call it intersubjective practices. People are mentioning it, like circling, collective presencing, and they use the term collective intelligence a lot, but it's gesturing towards something different, I would say. But if Dave Swedlow could plug in collective presencing, the event we have every Friday.
Yeah, thanks. So every Friday at 8 a.m. and noon Eastern time, we get together for 90 minutes of practice of collective presencing, and it's beginners are welcome. I see several regulars here in this group, so a lot of you have tried it, but it's an open session, so feel free to join us. No previous experience necessary, and it has proven to be quite profound. So you're welcome to come join us for that.
Cool. If you want to hang out with us, weirdo Stoics, maybe Stoics here at the Stoa, Anita, feel free to come. So you can check out more events on the website, Patreon, and Substack. That being said, everyone, thanks for coming to the Stoa today.